The wind at 19,000 feet doesn't whisper. It screams. It tears at exposed skin with teeth made of ice crystals, each gust carrying the promise of death. This is the realm mountaineers call the death zone, where the air holds barely a third of the oxygen found at sea level, where human cells begin to consume themselves just to keep the heart beating. Nothing lives here. Nothing can. The cold alone, plunging to 40 below zero, would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The altitude starves the brain. Clouds' judgment turns climbers into confused children stumbling toward oblivion. This is Earth's killing floor, a wasteland of rock and ice where even microbes struggle to exist. And yet, in 1951, something walked here. Something left its mark in the snow. Eric Shipton, a British mountaineer whose reputation for honesty was as solid as the mountains he climbed, was leading a reconnaissance expedition on the Menlung Glacier. These weren't amateur adventurers or superstitious locals. These were experienced climbers, men whose survival depended on careful observation and clear thinking. When they crested a ridge at 19,000 feet, they stopped. There, stretching across the pristine snow, was a line of footprints. Each print measured 13 inches long and 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the frozen surface. Whatever made them was heavy, powerful, and utterly impossible. Shipton photographed one print next to an ice axe for scale. That photograph would haunt the scientific community for decades. The print showed clear toes, a broad ball, a distinct heel. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't climb to 19,000 feet, and their tracks look nothing like this. It wasn't human. No human foot, even in the largest boot, creates such a print. The expedition followed the tracks for nearly a mile across the glacier before they vanished into terrain too technical to pursue. What walks where nothing should survive? What leaves human-like footprints in places where humans can barely breathe? The locals have a name for it. They've had that name for centuries, whispered around fires in mountain villages, passed from grandparent to grandchild like a warning. Yeti, the Abominable Snowman, the thing that lives between the world of men and the world of gods. But this documentary isn't about folklore. It's about the bodies, the expeditions that went silent, the physical evidence that keeps appearing in places where it shouldn't exist. It's about the growing file of encounters that don't fit comfortably into the category of myth or misidentification. Something is happening in the highest mountains on Earth, something that has been happening for as long as humans have dared to climb into those frozen wastes. In 1978, Polish mountaineer Krzysztof Wilicki was camped at 27,000 feet on Everest when he saw something moving across the Lhotse face. No expedition was scheduled in that location. The figure was walking upright, moving with purpose across ice fields that would kill an unacclimatized human in hours. He watched through binoculars until clouds obscured his view. When he reported the sighting, his fellow climbers didn't mock him. They simply nodded. They'd heard the stories too. Some had their own encounters they didn't discuss in official expedition reports. Because there's a cost to asking questions in these mountains. Don Lord, an American climber, organized 3 expeditions specifically to investigate Yeti reports between 1957 and 1959. His teams collected hair samples, took plaster casts of prints, interviewed dozens of Sherpa witnesses. During his final expedition, 2 team members vanished during a summit attempt. Their bodies were never recovered. The official cause was listed as altitude sickness and exposure, but Lord never mounted another expedition. He returned to the United States and refused to discuss what his team had found. When pressed by journalists, he would only say that some questions shouldn't be answered. The mounting evidence doesn't comfort skeptics. If anything, it deepens the mystery. A monastery in Pangboche claims to possess the scalp and hand of a Yeti, displayed for centuries as sacred relics. In 1960, mountaineer Peter Byrne allegedly stole a finger from the hand and smuggled it out of Nepal for analysis. The finger vanished into the collections of a private researcher and was never properly studied. The remaining hand stayed in Pangboche until it was stolen in 1991. The thieves left everything else of value untouched. They came only for the hand. What were they afraid might be proven? What truth was worth stealing evidence to suppress? This documentary will take you into the death zone, into the accounts of witnesses whose credentials can't be dismissed, into the physical traces that refuse to conform to comfortable explanations. We'll examine the expeditions that returned changed, the footage that analysts can't debunk, the hair samples that don't match any known species in the Himalayas. We'll speak with Sherpas who've spent their lives in these mountains, who know the difference between a bear track and something else, who carry offerings to leave at high camps not for luck, but for protection. We'll also confront the darkness these peaks inspire, the primal terror of being watched from above, of realizing you might not be alone in places where you should be utterly isolated. Mountains have always occupied a special place in human fear. They're the realm of gods and monsters, the boundary between our world and something older. The Himalayas aren't just the tallest peaks on Earth. They're the youngest major mountain range, still rising, still growing, thrust upward by continental plates grinding together with unimaginable force. In geological terms, they're infants. But the legends are ancient. Something calls these peaks home. Something that survives where survival should be impossible. The question isn't whether footprints exist. Dozens of photographs prove they do. The question is what makes them, and why it stays hidden in the one environment on Earth where humans can't pursue it for long. The death zone protects its secrets. Above 26,000 feet, the human body is dying. Every moment spent there steals life. Climbers can't linger to investigate mysteries. They summit and descend, or they become part of the mountain themselves, frozen monuments to curiosity that outlasted endurance. But the evidence keeps appearing. The sightings continue. And every year, a few climbers come down from the peaks with stories they'll only share quietly, away from official debriefings. Tales of movements in the snow, of finding camps disturbed by something that doesn't fear human presence, of sounds that echo between peaks where no animal should exist. This is their story. This is the mounting body of evidence. This is the question that has obsessed explorers, terrified locals, and cost lives. What walks the death zone of the Himalayas? The answer might be more terrifying than continued mystery. Because if something survives up there, something large and powerful and intelligent enough to evade conclusive proof for centuries, then the highest peaks on Earth aren't humanity's ultimate conquest. They're someone else's territory. And we're only visitors, tolerated or ignored by something that was there first, and will be there long after our generation of climbers has turned to ice. The truth is waiting at 19,000 feet. The question is whether you're prepared for what it might reveal. Long before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay planted their flags on the summit of Everest, long before Western explorers ever dreamed of conquering the Himalayas, the people who called these mountains home already knew the truth. They knew these frozen peaks harbored something that defied explanation, something that watched from the shadows of glaciers and moved through storms like a phantom. The Sherpa people, the Tibetans, the Bhutanese villagers, scattered across the roof of the world. They possessed knowledge, passed down through countless generations, knowledge that spoke of the Maigoi, the wild man, the creature of the high places. This was not folklore created to entertain children around evening fires. This was survival information, deadly serious warnings carved into the very foundation of mountain culture. The Sherpas call it Migoi, meaning wild man or man-beast. The Tibetans know it as Medaokongmi, the Abominable Snowman, though this translation fails to capture the reverence and terror embedded in the original word. Neto means filthy or foul. Kangmi translates to snowman, but together they describe something far more specific than Western interpretations suggest. These are not vague monsters from children's stories. According to the oral histories maintained by village elders and documented in the ancient texts preserved within Buddhist monasteries, these creatures possess distinct characteristics that have remained eerily consistent across centuries and across communities, separated by hundreds of miles of impossible terrain. In the Tengboche Monastery, perched at an elevation of over 12,000 feet in the Khumbu region of Nepal, monks have maintained records for over 300 years. Within their libraries, protected from the harsh elements by thick stone walls, ancient manuscripts describe encounters with the Maigoi in precise detail. The texts, written in classical Tibetan script, speak of beings that stand between 7 and 9 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown or dark gray hair that grows thicker in winter months. The hair is described as coarse, almost like yak fur but longer, hanging in matted tangles across powerful shoulders. The face, according to these records, appears flattened, more human than ape, with a pronounced brow ridge and deep-set eyes that reflect light like those of nocturnal animals. The monks who transcribed these accounts noted specific details about the creature's build, describing broad chests, arms that hung past the knees, and hands large enough to crack the skull of a snow leopard with a single blow. What makes these descriptions particularly unsettling is their consistency. In Bhutan, over 400 miles east of Tengboche, village elders recount nearly identical physical features when they speak of the Migoat. They describe the same reddish-brown hair, the same disproportionate arm length, the same flattened face with prominent brow ridges. These communities had no contact with one another for most of their history. The mountains between them formed natural barriers that prevented regular communication. Trade routes existed, but they were dangerous and rarely traveled. Yet somehow, isolated villages separated by weeks of treacherous mountain passes all developed identical descriptions of a creature they claimed roamed the highest elevations. The behavioral patterns documented in monastery texts and oral histories show equally disturbing consistency. The Migoi, according to these accounts, exhibits territorial behavior similar to other apex predators, but with an intelligence that sets it apart. Witnesses throughout the centuries have described the creatures as primarily nocturnal, though sightings during heavy snowstorms occur frequently even in daylight hours. The Migoi allegedly moves with surprising stealth for its size, navigating vertical rock faces and crossing crevasse fields that would challenge experienced mountaineers. Multiple accounts describe the creature walking upright through snow that would force humans to crawl, its stride long and purposeful, seemingly unbothered by altitude or cold that would kill an unprotected person in hours. Perhaps most chilling are the consistent reports of the Migoi's vocalizations. Sherpa guides, who have spent decades leading expeditions through the Himalayas, describe a sound they claim belongs to nothing else on Earth. It begins as a low rumbling, felt more than heard, that seems to vibrate through the chest cavity. This builds into a high-pitched scream that echoes across valleys, a sound that carries for miles in the thin mountain air. Witnesses say the cry contains an almost human quality that makes the blood run cold, as if some aspect of intelligence lurks behind the noise. These vocalizations, they claim, serve as warnings. When the Migoi screams, it is establishing territory, telling intruders to leave before something terrible happens. The Sherpa culture, forged over centuries of survival in one of Earth's harshest environments, treats the Migoi not as myth, but as dangerous reality. Families pass down specific protocols for avoiding encounters, rules as important as knowing which crevasses to avoid or how to read changing weather patterns. Young Sherpas learn early that certain valleys remain off-limits, not due to avalanche danger or difficult terrain, but because they belong to the Migoi. These forbidden zones exist throughout the Himalayas, marked not by signs but by cultural memory and absolute conviction. Near the village of Namch Bazar, a high valley called Kumbila is considered sacred and forbidden. Even today, in the 21st century, local Sherpas refuse to climb within this area. They will guide clients up Everest, risk their lives daily on icefall and summit pushes, face storms and avalanches with remarkable courage, yet they will not set foot in Kumbila. When pressed for explanation, many simply state that it is not permitted, that the mountain belongs to other inhabitants, that to violate these boundaries invites disaster. Western climbers have occasionally disregarded these warnings, venturing into forbidden zones despite pleading from Sherpa guides. Some return with stories of unexplained noises, massive footprints in fresh snow, the sensation of being watched by something massive and unseen. Others never return at all, their disappearances attributed to falls or exposure, but the locals know differently. Buddhist monastery records document protective rituals designed specifically to ward off Migoi encounters. These ceremonies, still performed today before major expeditions, involve elaborate prayers, the burning of juniper incense, and the creation of blessed amulets that travelers wear close to their hearts. The ritual is not superstition to the Sherpas who perform it. They approach these ceremonies with the same seriousness Western climbers might approach checking oxygen equipment or testing radios. The lamas who conduct these blessings draw from texts that describe previous encounters, cautionary tales of what happens when proper respect is not shown to the mountains and their inhabitants. One such account, preserved in the Pangboshe Monastery, describes an incident from the late 1800s. A group of yak herders, driven by desperation during a particularly harsh winter, ventured into a valley they knew to be forbidden. They needed grazing land for their starving animals and gambled that the old warnings were mere superstition. According to the monastery record, 3 men and 37 yaks entered the valley at about dawn. By sunset, villagers heard screaming echoing from the mountains. 2 men stumbled back to the village after nightfall, frostbitten and incoherent with terror. They spoke of something massive that came from the rocks, moving impossibly fast, scattering the yaks like leaves in wind. The 3rd man and all 37 animals were never found. The next morning, tracks were discovered at the valley entrance, prints that measured over 16 inches long and showed 4 toes and a distinct heel mark pressed deep into frozen ground. The surviving herders described a creature covered in dark hair that stood upright like a man but moved with the power of a bear. What strikes modern researchers who study these accounts is not just the consistency of physical descriptions, but the seriousness with which generations of mountain people have treated this information. The Sherpa culture produces some of the world's most accomplished mountaineers, people who possess intimate knowledge of high-altitude conditions and animal behavior. These are not individuals prone to panic or confusion. They can identify the call of every bird, recognize the tracks of snow leopards and wolves, navigate by stars and landmarks in conditions that would disorient experienced Western climbers. When these same people state with absolute conviction that something unknown inhabits the high peaks, when they refuse to enter certain areas despite financial incentives, when they perform protective rituals before every major climb, it demands consideration. The oral histories maintained by Sherpa families contain detailed accounts passed parent to child for generations. These stories include specific locations, seasonal patterns, and behavioral information. Elder Sherpas speak of the Migoi descending to lower elevations during the harshest winter months, driven by hunger to areas where they might encounter humans. They describe finding evidence of the creatures the morning after heavy snowstorms, long lines of deep prints crossing ridges at elevations above 20,000 feet, where no human could survive overnight without shelter. They recount discoveries of animals killed in ways that match no known predator, yaks with necks twisted completely around, baral sheep found at the bottom of cliffs with no explanation for what could have thrown them from such heights. The traditional Tibetan medical texts, some dating back over 1,000 years, contain references to the Migoe that suggest these beings were once even more commonly encountered. Ancient remedies warn against eating snow from certain elevations, claiming it may have been contaminated by the Migoe. Other passages describe treatments for injuries sustained during encounters, recommending specific herbs and prayer combinations to address both physical wounds and spiritual contamination. The matter-of-fact inclusion of these creatures in medical texts, alongside treatments for altitude sickness and frostbite, suggests that encounters were once considered an ordinary hazard of mountain life. As Western influence spread through the Himalayas and expeditions began probing deeper into previously untouched regions, Sherpa warnings became more urgent. The indigenous peoples watched foreigners dismiss their knowledge, saw outsiders laugh at stories that had guided survival for centuries. Yet the Sherpas continued to refuse entry into forbidden zones, continued to perform protective rituals, continued to take their warnings as seriously as their ancestors had for generations. Because they understood something that Western skeptics could not grasp. The mountains do not forgive ignorance. The high peaks hold secrets that demand respect. And somewhere in the frozen waste above the tree line, in the permanent ice fields and wind-scoured ridges, something ancient continues to watch, to wait, to remind those who listen that humanity does not reign supreme in all corners of the world. The morning of November 8, 1951, dawned clear and bitterly cold on the Menlung Glacier, where a British expedition led by Eric Shipton was conducting reconnaissance work for what would eventually become the historic 1953 conquest of Everest. At an altitude of 18,000 feet, the air was thin enough to make every breath a conscious effort, and the landscape stretched out in an unforgiving expanse of ice and rock that seemed entirely hostile to life of any kind. Yet it was here, in this frozen wasteland where even the hardiest of creatures rarely ventured, that Shipton and his colleague Michael Ward would stumble upon something that would fundamentally alter the way the scientific community viewed the persistent legends of the Himalayan Yeti. Eric Shipton was not some wide-eyed amateur prone to sensationalism or flights of fancy. By 1951, he had established himself as one of the most respected mountaineers of his generation, a man whose reputation was built on meticulous observation, careful documentation, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. He had led expeditions to Everest in 1933, 1935, and 1938. He had explored vast stretches of the Karakoram Range and mapped regions of Central Asia that had never before been surveyed by Western eyes. His colleagues described him as thoughtful, methodical, and refreshingly free of the tendency toward exaggeration that sometimes plagued expedition reports of that era. When Shipton said he had seen something, people listened because he had earned the credibility that commanded attention. That November morning, Shipton and Ward were traversing a section of the Menlung Glacier that sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet, making their way across pristine snow that had fallen recently enough to provide a blank canvas unmarked by wind or subsequent weather. They were focused on their survey work, documenting the terrain and assessing possible routes, when Ward suddenly stopped and pointed down at the snow before them. There, pressed into the fresh powder with remarkable clarity, was a line of footprints unlike anything either man had seen before. The prints were enormous, far larger than any human foot could produce. Shipton immediately knelt down beside them, his scientific training taking over as he began to examine the tracks with the careful attention he might give to any significant discovery. The prints measured 13 inches in length and 8 inches in width, dimensions that Shipton meticulously recorded in his expedition notes. But it was not merely their size that captured his attention. The prints showed clear anatomical detail, including what appeared to be a large toe offset from 4 smaller toes, suggesting a foot structure that was neither fully human nor consistent with any known animal of the region. Understanding the potential significance of what they had found, Shipton did exactly what any trained observer would do. He reached into his pack and retrieved his camera and Kodak retina that he had used throughout the expedition to document their findings. But photographs alone, he knew, could be dismissed or questioned without proper scale reference. So Shipton placed his ice axe beside one of the clearest prints, providing an unmistakable point of comparison that would allow anyone examining the photographs later to verify the dimensions he had measured. He took several exposures, adjusting his position to capture the prints from different angles, ensuring that the detail of the ridges and indentations would be visible in the developed images. The tracks stretched out before them in a clear line, each print spaced in a regular walking gait that suggested a bipedal creature moving with purpose across the glacier. Shipton and Ward followed the trail for a considerable distance, watching as it led steadily upward toward even more inhospitable terrain. This detail would later become one of the most chilling aspects of the entire discovery. Whatever had made these prints was not descending from the heights, perhaps injured or disoriented, but climbing deliberately toward elevations where oxygen levels were even lower and temperatures even more brutal. The tracks led toward regions where no known large mammal had any reason to venture, where food would be non-existent and survival would be a constant battle against the elements. The two men followed the prints for nearly a mile across the glacier, documenting their progress and noting how the tracks maintained their clarity in the protected snow. In some places, where the creature had apparently negotiated obstacles or changed direction, the prints showed even more detail, including what appeared to be pressure points and weight distribution patterns that suggested a living, moving being rather than some trick of the light or artifact of the snow itself. Eventually, the tracks led into terrain too treacherous for Shipton and Ward to follow safely, disappearing into the vast white emptiness of the upper glacier where the snow merged with rock and ice in a chaotic jumble of seracs and crevasses. When Shipton returned to civilization and the photographs were developed, the response was immediate and intense. The images were published in newspapers and journals around the world, reproduced in countless magazines and scientific publications. Here, finally, was physical evidence that seemed to transcend the realm of folklore and legend. These were not blurry images captured in poor light by unreliable witnesses. These were crystal-clear photographs taken by one of the most respected mountaineers of the era, a man with no history of sensationalism and every reason to protect his professional reputation. The scientific community found itself in an uncomfortable position. Dismissing Shipton outright seemed impossible given his credentials and the quality of the documentation he had provided. Yet accepting the implications of the photographs meant acknowledging that something large, bipedal, and unknown to science was living at extreme altitudes in one of the most studied mountain ranges on Earth. The debate that followed was intense and often contentious, with researchers from various disciplines weighing in with theories and counter-theories. Zoologists attempted to identify the prints as belonging to known animals. The first and most obvious candidate was the Himalayan black bear, which was known to occasionally venture to high altitudes and could, under certain circumstances, leave tracks that might be confused with something more mysterious. But this explanation quickly ran into problem. Black bear tracks, even when partially melted or distorted by weather, maintained certain characteristics that were simply absent from Shipton's photographs. Bears have claws that leave clear marks in snow, and their foot structure, while superficially similar to a large human foot when walking bipedally, shows distinctive pad patterns that were not present in the Menlung Glacier prints. Other researchers suggested that the tracks might have been made by a langur monkey, large specimens of which were known to inhabit lower elevations of the Himalayan forests. But this theory was even more problematic. Langurs rarely ventured above 12,000 feet, and there was simply no ecological reason for them to be at 18,000 feet on a barren glacier. Moreover, langur tracks, even from the largest individuals, were nowhere near the size of what Shipton had documented. The proportion of the prints, the gait pattern, and the apparent weight of the creature that made them all argued against any known primate of the region. Some skeptics proposed that the prints were actually human tracks that had been enlarged by melting and subsequent refreezing, a phenomenon that can indeed distort tracks in snow. Shipton himself had considered this possibility and dismissed it based on several factors. First, the prints showed too much internal detail to be merely melted and enlarged tracks. The ridges and depressions within each print suggested fresh tracks that had not undergone significant weathering. Second, the regular spacing and consistent size of the prints along the entire trail argued against random distortion. And third, Shipton and Ward were experienced enough in mountain travel to recognize melted tracks when they saw them, having observed countless examples throughout their careers. As the debate continued through the 1950s and beyond, expeditions specifically organized to search for the Yeti began to mount with increasing frequency. The Daily Mail sponsored a major expedition in 1954, bringing together scientists, mountaineers, and journalists in a coordinated effort to investigate the phenomenon. Other expeditions followed, each attempting to replicate Shipton's findings or gather additional evidence that might resolve the mystery once and for all. The photographs had transformed the Yeti from a subject of local folklore into a legitimate target of scientific inquiry, however controversial that inquiry might be. What made Shipton's photographs so compelling, and what continues to make them relevant more than 70 years later, was not just the clarity of the images, but the complete absence of any satisfactory conventional explanation. Every attempt to debunk the photographs or explain them away through known animal behavior has left significant questions unanswered. The prints remain, frozen in time in those black and white images, as mysterious today as they were when Shipton first knelt beside them in the snow. The psychological impact of the photographs extended far beyond scientific circles. For the general public, Shipton's images provided tangible evidence that the world still held mysteries, that there were corners of the earth where the unknown still reigned. In the post-war years of the early 1950s, when rational science seemed to be explaining away so many of the world's mysteries, the Menlung Glacier photographs served as a powerful reminder that nature could still surprise us, that our maps and catalogs might not be as complete as we imagine. For the people of the Himalayan regions, Shipton's discovery offered a different kind of validation. The Sherpa people had spoken of the Yeti for generations, describing it as a creature of the high places, rarely seen but undeniably present in their traditional understanding of the mountains. Western explorers had often dismissed these accounts as superstition or misidentification. Now, one of the West's most respected mountaineers had documented something that seemed to vindicate the persistent claims of the local people. The photographs became a bridge between traditional knowledge and modern science. forcing researchers to take seriously the accumulated wisdom of cultures that had lived in these mountains for centuries. The tracks on the Menlung Glacier remain unexplained to this day, standing as perhaps the single most credible piece of physical evidence in the entire history of Yeti research. No subsequent discovery has matched the combination of clarity, documentation, and witness credibility that Shipton provided on that November morning in 1951. The photographs continue to be analyzed, debated, and discussed, each new generation of researchers bringing fresh perspectives and modern techniques to bear on those grainy, black and white images. What Shipton captured that day was more than just a set of mysterious footprints. He documented a moment when the boundaries of the known world seemed to shift, when the confidence of scientific certainty met something that defied easy categorization. In that frozen instant, preserved in silver halide crystals on photographic film, the Yeti stepped from legend into documented history, leaving behind evidence that continues to challenge our understanding of what might still be discovered in the remote places of our planet. The Himalayas keep their secrets well. In the vast expanses of ice and stone that stretch across the roof of the world, people vanish with disturbing regularity. Most disappearances are eventually explained by the brutal mathematics of high-altitude mountaineering, where a single misstep or a sudden storm can erase a climber from existence. But some cases resist easy explanation. Some vanishings follow patterns that suggest something other than natural forces at work. In the spring of 1970, a Japanese expedition arrived in the Langtang Valley of Nepal with ambitious goals. They planned to summit several previously unclimbed peaks and conduct extensive photography of the region. The team consisted of 11 experienced mountaineers, men who had collectively spent decades in high-altitude environments. Their expedition leader, Takeshi Yamamoto, had successfully climbed K2 3 years earlier. These were not novices stumbling unprepared into dangerous territory. They knew the mountains. They understood the risks. The expedition established base camp at approximately 14,000 feet in a sheltered basin surrounded by unnamed peaks. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded according to plan. The climbers acclimatized, established higher camps, and began their summit attempts. But in their third week, the tone of their radio communications began to change. Yamamoto mentioned in one transmission that team members had found unusual tracks in the snow above Camp 2IL. Large tracks, bipedal tracks. He described them matter-of-factly, without alarm, noting only that they were remarkably clear and appeared fresh. 3 days later, another transmission. This time, Yamamoto's voice carried a different quality. He reported that 2 climbers returning from a reconnaissance had seen something moving parallel to their position on a distant ridge. Through binoculars, they watched it traverse steep terrain that should have been impassable for anything walking on 2 legs. The figure, they said, was massive, much larger than a human. It moved with purpose across slopes, where even experienced climbers would need ropes and protection. When they tried to photograph it, the distance proved too great. By the time they repositioned, the figure had vanished behind an outcropping. The following day brought more sightings. Multiple team members reported glimpses of something moving in the periphery of their vision. A shape behind boulders near Camp 1. A silhouette crossing a snowfield at dusk. The sense of being observed became pervasive. In one transmission preserved in the expedition archives, Yamamoto acknowledged that the team felt stalked. He used that specific word, stalked, like prey animals being assessed by a predator. On the morning of April 23rd, 2 climbers, Hiroshi Nakamura and Kenji Sato, left Camp 2 for what should have been a straightforward summit push. The weather was clear. Visibility extended for miles. They carried 2-way radios and were expected to make regular check-ins. They made their first scheduled contact at 9 in the morning, reporting good progress and perfect conditions. They never made their second check-in. When they failed to report at noon, concern rippled through base camp. By 2 in the afternoon, a search party was already climbing toward their last known position. What the searchers found was deeply unsettling. They located the climbers' route easily enough. The tracks in the snow told a clear story of steady upward progress. But at approximately 18,000 feet, the tracks simply ended. Not gradually, as if the climbers had been buried by avalanche, not scattered by wind. They just stopped, as if Nakamura and Sato had been plucked from the mountain. The searchers fanned out, covering every possible deviation from the route. They found nothing. No bodies. No equipment beyond a single ice axe lying on undisturbed snow. No blood. No signs of struggle. 2 experienced mountaineers had evaporated in broad daylight on a clear day. The search continued for 5 days, expanding to cover square miles of terrain. Helicopters were eventually brought in. They found nothing. But they did find other tracks. Large bipedal tracks that intersected the climber's route at almost exactly the point where Nakamura and Sato's footprints ended. The tracks came from above, from terrain the expedition had considered too steep and unstable for approach. They merged with the climbing route, then veered sharply away, descending into a deep ravine that eventually became impassable. The search team photographed these tracks extensively. The prints measured nearly 16 inches long and showed clear toe definition. Whatever made them had been moving fast, leaving deep impressions in firm snow. The expedition abandoned their objectives and evacuated. In subsequent interviews, team members spoke reluctantly about their experience. Several described an overwhelming sense of malevolent presence in their final days on the mountain. Yamato himself would later write that he believed something had been systematically observing them, learning their patterns, waiting for isolation and opportunity. He never climbed in the Himalayas again. The Nakamura and Sato case is far from unique. It simply happens to be unusually well documented, preserved in official expedition reports and radio transcript. But researchers who focus on high-altitude disappearances have identified dozens of similar incidents. Cases where experienced climbers vanish completely, where search parties find impossible tracks, where the pattern suggests something other than accident or misadventure. Consider the 1984 incident in the Barun Valley, another Nepali region with a long history of Yeti sightings. A German expedition lost a climber named Klaus Werner, under circumstances that left investigators baffled. Werner was descending alone from Camp 3 in clear weather when he activated his emergency beacon. The signal indicated he was stationary. A rescue team reached his location within 2 hours. They found the beacon lying on bare rock. They found Werner's backpack, contents undisturbed. They found boot prints, showing he had removed his crampons and carefully placed them beside his pack. Then nothing. No further tracks. No body. The rock face above and below his position was vertical or overhanging. There was nowhere to fall to, nowhere to climb. Klaus Werner had simply ceased to exist at that spot. But the most disturbing cases are not the vanishings. They are the bodies that are eventually found. Bodies discovered with trauma that defies easy explanation. Injuries that seem impossible given the circumstances of the death. In 1991, 3 climbers disappeared during a storm on Kangchenjunga, the world's 3rd highest peak. They had been descending from Camp 4 when the weather closed in. Search efforts were mounted as soon as conditions allowed, but the terrain was vast and unforgiving. The search was eventually called off, the climbers presumed buried in one of the countless crevasses that scar the mountain's flanks. 2 years later, a Polish expedition found them. The bodies had been exposed by shifting ice in a location miles from their intended descent route. What struck the discoverers immediately was the condition of the remains. All 3 climbers had suffered catastrophic trauma to their torsos. Ribs shattered, sternums crushed, internal organs pulverized. The expedition doctor who examined the bodies before they were removed from the mountain documented injuries consistent with massive compressive force, as if something had grabbed each climber and squeezed. Falls don't produce that pattern of injury. Bodies that fall in mountains suffer trauma to extremities, to heads, to spines. They don't show symmetrical crushing compression to the torso. Avalanches bury and suffocate. They break bones through tumbling, not through focused pressure. The Polish team filed a detailed report noting these inconsistencies, but the official conclusion remained death by misadventure during storm conditions. Nobody wanted to suggest alternative explanation. Similar cases emerged from Soviet-era archives, now slowly being translated and analyzed. In 1973, A team of Kazakh climbers working in the Chinese Pamirs found a body that had been preserved in ice for an estimated 10 to 15 years. When they attempted to extract it for proper burial, they discovered the entire skeleton had been shattered. Not just broken, pulverized, reduced to fragments held together only by frozen tissue. One team member later described it as looking like the victim had been put through industrial machinery. The Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, though not in traditional Yeti territory, shows similar patterns. 9 experienced cross-country skiers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains. When their bodies were finally recovered months later, several showed injuries that investigating physicians described as requiring force equivalent to a serious car crash. One victim had massive skull damage. Another had severe thoracic trauma with missing eyes and tongue. The tent had been cut open from inside, suggesting the group fled from something. They ran into deadly cold, wearing minimal clothing. Whatever they were escaping, they chose freezing to death over facing it. Geographic analysis reveals unsettling patterns. Researchers have mapped high-altitude disappearances and unexplained deaths across the Himalayas, Pamirs, and adjacent ranges. Certain valleys emerge as clusters. Certain specific locations see repeated incidents across decades. The Langtang Valley, where the Japanese expedition lost Nakamura and Sato, has had at least 7 documented disappearances since 1965 that remain officially unexplained. The Barun Valley has had 5. The Menlong Basin, a remote glacial valley in Nepal, has had 9. These are not the most climbed areas. They are not the most dangerous in terms of objective hazards like avalanche or rockfall. They are simply the valleys where people vanish more frequently than statistics would predict. They are also, according to local Sherpa communities, the valleys where the Yeti is most often sighted. The correlation is difficult to ignore. The victims are almost always experienced. This is not a pattern of foolish tourists wandering unprepared into dangerous terrain. The disappeared and the dead are professional mountaineers, expedition guides, climbers with years or decades of high-altitude experience. They know how to read weather. They understand avalanche danger. They carry proper equipment and follow established safety protocols. And still they vanish. Or they are found broken in ways that mountains alone cannot explain. What stalks these remote valleys? What kind of creature could crush a grown man's torso with sufficient force to shatter every rib? What possesses the intelligence to track expeditions, to learn patterns, to strike when victims are isolated? The questions hang in the thin air of high places, unanswered and deeply unsettling. Local communities have their own explanations, passed down through generations. They speak of the Yeti not as a shy, reclusive creature, but as an apex predator. Territorial. 4. Aggressive when threatened or disturbed. Capable of remarkable intelligence and frightening violence. They point to the very valleys where disappearances cluster and say, yes, of course, people die there. That is the Yeti's domain. You do not enter lightly. You do not go alone. The pattern continues. Climbers still vanish in specific locations. Bodies still emerge from melting glaciers bearing trauma that resists explanation. And in expedition reports and rescue team accounts, the same details recur. The sense of being watched. The unexplained tracks. The feeling that something large and hostile is moving just beyond the edge of perception. Not all accidents in the mountains are accidents. Some encounters go catastrophically wrong. And in the remotest valleys of the highest peaks, something waits in the snow. Deep in the frozen highlands of the Himalayas, behind monastery walls that have stood for centuries, there exists a collection of artifacts that defies simple explanation. These are not golden Buddhas or ancient scrolls, though those treasures certainly fill the prayer halls and libraries. These are physical specimens, biological relics preserved with the same reverence given to the bones of saints. Scalps covered in reddish-brown hair, hands with elongated fingers. Fragments of bone from creatures the monks insist are not entirely animal and not entirely human. The lamas who guard these relics do not treat them as curiosities. They treat them as proof. The story of how Western science came to examine these specimens begins in the waning days of the 1950s. when the World Book Encyclopedia sponsored an expedition with an unusual purpose. While most expeditions to the Himalayas sought to conquer peaks or map uncharted valleys, this team came with a different goal. They wanted samples. They wanted to bring pieces of the mystery back to laboratories in America and Britain, to subject the legends to the harsh light of scientific scrutiny. What they found, and what happened to those samples afterward, would only deepen the enigma surrounding the Yeti. The expedition, led by Sir Edmund Hillary himself, the man who had conquered Everest just 6 years earlier, arrived in Nepal with official permissions and significant funding. Hillary was skeptical about the Yeti's existence, but he was a thorough man, and he understood that speculation, without evidence, served no purpose. If the monasteries held physical specimens, those specimens could be tested. DNA analysis was still decades away from the sophistication it would later achieve, but protein analysis, hair morphology studies, and comparative anatomy could reveal much about what these artifacts truly were. The team focused their attention on several monasteries known to possess Yeti relics. At Kumyung Monastery, perched at an altitude of 12,000 feet in the shadow of Everest itself, the monks maintained what they called a Yeti scalp. The object was kept in a locked wooden box, brought out only for special ceremonies. The scalp was dome-shaped, covered in coarse reddish hair that stood upright, creating an almost crown-like appearance. The hair itself was unlike anything the expedition members had seen. It was thick, each strand measuring several times the diameter of human hair, with a peculiar texture that seemed to change depending on the light. The abbot of Kumyong was an elderly man named Lobsang, who had served the monastery for over 40 years. He told the expedition, through translators, that the scalp had been in the monastery's possession for more than 200 years. According to the oral history passed down through generations of monks, a hunting party from a nearby village had encountered a creature in the high passes during a harsh winter. The creature had been weakened, possibly injured, and the hunters managed to kill it. Terrified by what they had done, they brought the body to the monastery, seeking guidance. The lamas performed rituals over the corpse and preserved the scalp as a reminder of the mountain's mystery. The rest of the body, Lobsang explained, had been cremated according to Buddhist tradition. Hillary's team requested permission to take the scalp to laboratories in the West. After lengthy negotiations and assurances that the relic would be treated with respect and returned, the monks agreed, but on one condition. A monk would accompany the scalp on its journey. And so, in a scene that must have seemed surreal to observers, the sacred relic traveled by helicopter, then airplane, then automobile to facilities in Paris, London, and Chicago, always under the watchful eye of its monastic guardian. The initial results were shocking. Analysts in Paris examined the hair under high-powered microscopes and found structural anomalies they could not immediately explain. The medulla, the central core of each hair shaft, showed patterns that did not match any known primate in their reference collections. The cuticle scale patterns were equally puzzling. One researcher, a specialist in mammalian hair identification named Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans, stated for the record that the specimens showed characteristics of an unknown primate. The word unknown carried tremendous weight in scientific circles. It did not mean unidentified. It meant something potentially undiscovered. But science is a process of refinement and challenge. Other laboratories examined the same samples and reached different conclusions. Researchers in London declared the hair came from a sero, a goat-like animal native to the Himalayas. The scalp itself, they suggested, had been fashioned from sero skin, shaped while wet and allowed to dry into its distinctive dome form. This explanation satisfied many skeptics, but it left questions unanswered. Why would monks preserve a manufactured object with such reverence? Why would the oral histories describe an encounter with the creature, not the crafting of a ceremonial object? And why did some of the hair samples still resist definitive classification? The scalp was returned to Kumyong Monastery, and the debate continued in academic journals and popular magazines. But the World Book Expedition had visited other monasteries as well, and the most controversial specimens came from a place called Pangboche. Pangboche Monastery sits at an elevation of 13,000 feet, one of the highest permanent settlements in the world. The air is thin enough that visitors struggle to walk without gasping. The monastery is small, ancient, and remote even by Himalayan standards. Here, the monks possessed something far more tangible than a scalp. They possessed what they called a Yeti hand. The hand was kept in the monastery's shrine room, mounted in a position of ritual significance. It was large, much larger than a human hand, with elongated fingers that ended in broad, flat nails. The thumb was positioned in a way that suggested significant opposability, more than seen in apes, but different from the human configuration. The skin was dark, almost black in places, mummified by centuries of dry mountain air. Most striking were the fingers, which measured nearly twice the length of human fingers, with an extra joint that allowed them to curl in ways human hands cannot. The monks of Pangboshe told a different story than those at Kumyum. According to the lamas, the hand came from a creature killed in the 1700s, during a period when the monastery was being constructed. Workers building the stone walls reported being harassed by a large creature that raided their supplies and frightened their yaks. A group of men tracked the creature to a cave and killed it with arrows and stones. The hand had been severed and preserved as both trophy and warning, a reminder that even the mysterious beings of the mountains could be overcome by determined humans. This hand became the focus of one of the most controversial episodes in cryptozoology history. In 1959, the same year as the World Book expedition, a different group of Western researchers visited Pangboshe. Among them was Peter Byrne, an explorer who had become obsessed with finding evidence of the Yeti. Byrne examined the hand and immediately recognized its potential value to science. But the monks refused to allow the hand to leave the monastery. They would not even permit samples to be taken. What happened next remains disputed to this day. According to later accounts, Byrne and an associate returned to the monastery and, with the help of someone within the monastic community, stole several finger bones from the hand, replacing them with human bones in an attempt to conceal the theft. The bones were smuggled out of Nepal, reportedly with the assistance of actor James Stewart, who was filming in the region, and his wife Gloria. The bones traveled to London hidden in Gloria Stewart's luggage, an act that, if true, involved multiple violations of Nepalese law and Buddhist sacrilege. The stolen bones were delivered to primatologist William Charles Osman Hill, who examined them and declared them to be of great interest. His analysis suggested they came from a large primate, but he could not definitively classify them. Before further testing could be completed, the bones vanished. Different accounts placed them in various locations. Some claim they were lost during a laboratory move. Others suggest they were deliberately hidden to avoid legal consequences. Still others believe they were returned to Nepal through unofficial channels. The violation did not go unnoticed in Pangboshe. The monks discovered the theft and were devastated. The hand, with its human replacement bones, lost some of its sacred character. But worse was to come. In 2004, the entire hand disappeared from the monastery. Whether it was stolen again, hidden by monks protecting it from further desecration, or lost during renovations to the building, no one will say with certainty. The monastery's current abbot refuses to discuss the matter with outsiders. Before the hand vanished, however, the age of DNA testing arrived, and fragments of the remaining material were analyzed in 2011 by researchers attempting to catalog unusual specimens held in private collection. A small sample, claimed to be from the Pangboshe hand, was subjected to genetic sequencing. The results were simultaneously tantalizing and frustrating. The sample showed significant contamination, likely from the many people who had handled it over the centuries. But portions of the genetic material could not be matched to known species in the available databases. The testing laboratory noted unknown sequences, but cautioned that this could mean many things: degradation of the sample, contamination from multiple sources, or database limitations, rather than evidence of an unknown primate. Other monastery specimens have undergone similar testing with similar inconclusive results. A bone fragment from Pangboshe Monastery, tested in 2013, yielded DNA that matched a prehistoric polar bear, a result so unexpected that it generated more questions than it answered. How would polar bear remains end up in a Himalayan monastery? Had ancient migration patterns brought polar bears to the region thousands of years ago? Or did the Yeti represent some relic population of a bear species thought extinct in the area? The monks themselves remain largely unconcerned with scientific debates. At Kumyong, where the scalp still resides, the current abbot speaks of the relic with quiet certainty. He says that his predecessors did not preserve manufactured objects or the remains of known animals. They preserved evidence of something extraordinary because such evidence had spiritual significance. The creatures, the Westerners call Yeti are, in the monastic understanding, beings that exist in the borderlands between the physical and spiritual realms. Physical evidence of them is rare because they are rare, dwelling in the highest and most remote places where humans seldom go. This perspective highlights a fundamental divide between scientific and traditional ways of knowing. Science demands repeatable evidence, classification within existing frameworks, clear answers to definite questions. The monastic tradition accepts mystery as a valid category of experience. Not everything requires explanation. Some truths exist beyond the reach of measurement. Yet the physical specimens remain, locked in boxes and shrine rooms, slowly degrading despite careful preservation. Each year, more genetic material is lost to time and environmental exposure. Each year, the possibility of definitive answers grows more remote. The stolen bones, wherever they are, represent not just missing evidence, but a lost opportunity for understanding. The vanished Pangbosh hand, with its impossible proportions and provocative morphology, might have held secrets that modern technology could finally unlock. What we are left with is a collection of fragments, both physical and narrative. Hair that some experts call unknown and others identify as zero. Bones that vanish before testing is complete. DNA results corrupted by contamination or pointing towards species that should not exist in these mountains. And through it all, the steady insistence of the monks that what they preserve is exactly what they claim it to be. Evidence of creatures their ancestors encountered, killed, or found dead in the eternal snows. The mystery endures because the evidence remains ambiguous, and perhaps that is fitting for a creature that exists, if it exists at all, in the ambiguous spaces of our world. The mountain air at 15,000 feet does something to the mind. The cold burns in the lungs, the altitude makes thoughts drift like clouds, and the silence becomes so absolute that the smallest sound tears through it like a scream. Which is why, when Reinhold Messner saw the creature in the fading twilight of 1986, he knew immediately that what stood before him was not a product of oxygen deprivation or exhaustion. It was real, and it was watching him. Messner had seen things in the mountains that would break most men. He had climbed Everest without oxygen, survived storms that killed his companions, endured frostbite that took his toes. He was not a man given to fantasy or panic. He was methodical, scientific, rational. But as he stood on that ridge in the Himalayas, these qualities made what he witnessed not less terrifying, but more. Because his trained eye could not dismiss what he saw. His experienced mind could not rationalize it away. There, approximately 30 meters from where he stood, a large bipedal creature moved across the scree with a fluidity that defied the terrain. The encounter lasted several minutes, though Messner would later say it felt like hours. The light was failing, that peculiar twilight that happens in high mountains where the sun drops behind peaks, and the world enters a state between day and night. Not dark enough to obscure, but dim enough to make edges uncertain. Except the creature's edges were not uncertain. It was solid, massive, undeniably there. Messner estimated its height at over 2 meters, covered entirely in dark reddish-brown hair that seemed to ripple as it moved. The face, partially visible in profile, was distinctly ape-like, but the way it held itself, the way it navigated the difficult terrain, spoke of something beyond any primate he had studied. What struck Messner most was the purposefulness of its movement. This was not an animal wandering randomly or foraging. It was traveling with intent, moving from one point to another with a knowledge of the landscape that suggested deep familiarity. It placed its feet, or what Messner assumed were feet, with precision on rocks that would have required a human climber to stop and carefully consider each step. The creature simply flowed, its gait unlike anything Messner had seen in bears, which were known to occasionally move upright. This was something that belonged on 2 legs, something for which bipedal movement was natural and primary. Then it paused and turned its head toward him. Messner would spend years trying to articulate what he saw in that moment, the feeling that accompanied that simple rotation of the creature's skull. It was the eyes that did it. Even at that distance, even in the failing light, he could see they held an intelligence, an awareness that transcended animal curiosity. He was being evaluated, assessed. The creature knew he was human. It understood what that meant. And in that understanding, Messner felt something he had rarely experienced in decades of mountain climbing. He felt afraid. Not the healthy fear that keeps a climber cautious, but something older, something that lived in the basement of human consciousness. The fear of being prey to something unknown. The creature held his gaze for what might have been 10 seconds, then simply turned and continued on its way, disappearing over a ridgeline with the same fluid grace it had displayed throughout. Messner stood frozen for several minutes after it vanished, his mind racing through explanations, discarding each one as insufficient. When he finally returned to base camp, he said nothing. What could he say that would not sound like altitude sickness or hallucination? But the memory stayed with him, vivid and sharp, refusing to fade like dreams fade. Eventually, he would write about it, speak about it, knowing that some would dismiss him as a crank, that his credibility would suffer. He did it anyway, because the truth of what he saw demanded acknowledgement. Messner's account might have remained an isolated oddity, the kind of story that gets tucked into the footnotes of mountaineering lore, except that his description matched others with disturbing precision. Across decades, across different expeditions, across cultural and linguistic barriers, witnesses kept reporting the same thing. 6 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, ape-like face, bipedal movement, moving through terrain with impossible ease. The consistency was what transformed these accounts from curiosities into something that demanded attention. In 2007, a Japanese expedition brought technology into the hunt. Led by experienced mountaineer Yoshiteru Takahashi, the team deployed thermal imaging cameras in the high Himalayas, focusing on areas above the tree line, where human presence was minimal and animal activity should have been identifiable. On the night of October 9th, at approximately 11:45 in the evening, one of their cameras captured something that the team initially assumed was a malfunction. A bipedal heat signature, clearly distinct from the cooler background of rock and ice, moving across a steep incline at an elevation of 16,000 feet. The footage, analyzed frame by frame, showed a figure approximately 2 meters tall moving on 2 legs across terrain that would require technical climbing equipment for a human to navigate safely. The heat signature was consistent with a large mammal, the body temperature suggesting something warm-blooded and active. The stride length, the arm swing, the proportion of limbs to torso all suggested a bipedal creature of substantial size. What the thermal camera could not capture was fur color or facial features, but what it did capture was movement that matched exactly what witnesses like Messner had described. The expedition brought in wildlife biologists to examine the footage. Could it be a bear? No, tupite. Bears occasionally rear up on hind legs, but do not sustain bipedal movement across difficult terrain for extended periods. The gait was all wrong. Could it be a human climber? Possible, but the location was far from any established routes. The time was late night in freezing conditions, and no expeditions were registered in that area. Could it be a hoax? Someone in a suit perpetrating an elaborate fraud? The technical climbing required to reach that location and move across it in darkness would be extraordinarily dangerous, and the expedition had multiple cameras at different locations, none of which captured any other human presence. The Japanese team submitted their findings to peer review, knowing the reception would be skeptical. What they offered was not proof, but data. Thermal footage showing something that should not exist, moving through an environment that kills unprepared humans with casual indifference. The reaction from the scientific community was predictably mixed. Some dismissed it outright, without serious examination. Others studied it carefully and admitted they had no conventional explanation. A few whispered privately that it corroborated what locals in the Himalayas had been saying for centuries. Physical descriptions from credible witnesses formed a tapestry of consistency that became harder to ignore. A British geologist working on a survey expedition in 1994 described an encounter at dawn with a creature that stood approximately 7 feet tall, covered in coarse reddish-brown hair that appeared lighter at the tips, giving it an almost frosted appearance. The face, he said, was the worst part. It was not a bear face or an ape face, but something in between, with deeply set eyes that reflected his flashlight beam with an amber glow. The creature had been drinking from a stream when he stumbled upon it. It looked up, water dripping from its mouth, and they stared at each other for a handful of heartbeats before it turned and moved up a nearly vertical cliff face, with speed that seemed to defy physics. A Russian ornithologist in 23, studying migration patterns in the Tibetan Plateau, reported finding massive footprints in morning snow that were fresh enough to still show edge definition. Following them out of scientific curiosity, he came upon the creature resting in the lee of a boulder. He estimated its weight at 300 kilograms, its body covered in thick, dark brown fur. When it became aware of his presence, it did not flee or attack. It simply stood to its full height, which the ornithologist estimated at nearly 2.5 meters, and stared at him. The intelligence in that stare, he later wrote, was what terrified him most. It was not the blank stare of an animal disturbed while resting. It was the focused attention of something that was deciding what to do about his presence. In 1986, the same year as Messner's encounter, British hiker Anthony Wooldridge was trekking in the Himalayas when he spotted what he initially thought was a person sitting motionless in the snow. Looking through binoculars, he realized it was not human. It was too large, too oddly proportioned. He quickly set up his camera with a telephoto lens and took several photographs before the figure, seeming to sense his attention, stood and walked away with smooth, unhurried stride. The photographs, when developed, showed something dark and massive in the snow. The shape was clearly bipedal, clearly not a rock or trick of light. What it was remained violently contested. Skeptics immediately claimed it was a rock formation or a Yeti-shaped piece of ice. Others suggested it was a person in unusual clothing. But Wooldridge was adamant about what he had seen move, what had responded to his presence. He submitted to interviews, polygraph tests, photographic analysis. Some experts who examined the images dismissed them as inconclusive. Others found them deeply disturbing because they could not definitively explain what they showed. The proportions were wrong for a human. The location was wrong for a casual hiker. The way it had moved, according to Wooldridge's testimony, was wrong for anything known to inhabit those mountains. What united all these accounts, beyond the physical descriptions, was the psychological impact. These were not people predisposed to believe in cryptids or given to flights of fancy. They were mountaineers, scientists, researchers, military personnel on training exercises. People whose credibility was their currency, who had everything to lose by reporting something that invited ridicule. Yet they reported it anyway, because what they had experienced refused to be forgotten or rationalized away. A common theme emerged in their testimonies. The eyes. Nearly every close-range witness mentioned the eyes and the feeling of being watched by something that understood it was watching a human. Not the blank regard of a predator assessing prey, but something closer to recognition. One witness, a climatologist who had spent 3 decades in extreme environments, tried to explain it in an interview. Dewaldell. She said it was like looking at something that existed in the gap between animal and human. Something that possessed awareness without language, intelligence without civilization. And in that gap, she said, lived a kind of primal terror that modern humans rarely experience. The terror of encountering something that our ancient ancestors might have known. Something that evolution had prepared us to fear, even if culture had taught us to forget. The primal fear was not about being attacked. Most witnesses reported that the creatures showed no aggression. The fear came from something deeper, something that triggered responses coded into human neurology before we built cities or wrote languages. It was the fear of sharing the world with another intelligent bipedal creature, one that had somehow remained hidden in the margins of human expansion. One that chose when to be seen and when to disappear. One that looked at us with eyes that held knowledge and intention, and something that might have been judgment. When these witnesses tried to sleep after their encounters, they reported similar experiences. The feeling of being watched persisted. They would wake in darkness with absolute certainty that something was outside their tent, just beyond the firelight, observing with those knowing eyes. Rational minds told them it was impossible, that the creature had moved on, that they were alone. But the primitive parts of their brains, the parts that evolved when humans were not yet apex predators, knew better. Those parts remembered when being watched meant being hunted, when the darkness held things with intelligence and intent, when the eyes that reflected firelight belonged to something that stood on 2 legs and thought its own unknowable thoughts. The footage first appeared on a Portuguese climbing forum in late 2014, uploaded by a user who hasn't logged in since. No fanfare, no sensational claims. Just a simple title, in broken English. "What is this we saw?" The file was timestamped October 9, 2014, and the metadata confirmed it was shot at 2,400 feet on the north face of Dhaulagiri, the world's 7th highest peak. For 3 days, it sat mostly unnoticed. Then a climber in Norway downloaded it, watched it, and immediately called his expedition partner. Within a week, the video had been shared across every serious mountaineering network in the world. Not on social media. Not on YouTube. Among professionals only, passed like contraband between people who understood what they were looking at. The footage runs 2 minutes and 43 seconds. The first 20 seconds show exactly what you'd expect from helmet camera footage at that altitude. Harsh, white landscape. The rhythmic rasp of breathing through an oxygen mask. A gloved hand adjusting the camera angle. The climber is traversing a knife-edge ridge, moving with the careful deliberation that keeps you alive in the death zone. Then the camera pans right, following the ridgeline toward a massive cornice of wind-sculpted ice. And there, perhaps 400 yards away, something moves. The figure is dark against the snow. Bipedal dal. Moving across a section of near-vertical ice face that shouldn't be passable without fixed ropes and technical gear. But this thing isn't climbing. It's walking. Not the careful, measured movements of a mountaineer testing each step. It's moving with fluid confidence across terrain where a single misstep means a 3,000-foot fall. The climber behind the camera has stopped breathing normally. You can hear it on the audio. The steady rhythm breaks. There's a sharp intake of breath, then nothing for several seconds. When breathing resumes, it's rapid and shallow. The camera zooms, digital zoom that pixelates the image but brings the figure closer. The hand holding the camera is shaking now, creating a jitter in the footage. The figure continues across the ice face for another 30 seconds. Then, it stops. For a moment, it's completely still, and you can make out its silhouette more clearly. Broad shoulders, arms slightly longer than human proportion. The head turns, and though the distance and image quality make details impossible, the movement is deliberate, precise. It's looking at something. It's looking at the camera. What happens next is what made serious people take notice. The figure doesn't flee, doesn't scramble away like a startled animal. Instead, it moves laterally, positioning itself against a backdrop of ice where the contrast makes it more visible. Then it rises to its full height. The climber's breathing has become a series of panicked gasps. Someone off camera says something in Portuguese, voice tight with fear. The figure remains visible for another 40 seconds, standing motionless, before it turns and moves upslope, ascending a 60-degree ice face with impossible ease, finally disappearing over a serac field that the expedition notes described as impassable. The video ends. But the footage was just the beginning. 3 biomechanics experts from different institutions examined the movement patterns independently. Their assessments, shared privately within academic circles, were remarkably consistent and deeply troubling. Dr. Sarah Chen, from Stanford's Department of Bioengineering, spent 6 weeks analyzing the gait. Her report, never published but circulated among colleagues, detailed how the figure's movement across the ice face violated basic principles of human locomotion at altitude. At 21,000 feet, she noted, humans are operating in severe oxygen debt. Every movement is calculated, energy conserving. The figure in the footage moved with a fluidity that suggested either full acclimatization beyond human capability or a respiratory system fundamentally different from Homo sapiens. The stride length, when calculated against the known dimensions of the ice features, suggested a height between 7 and 8 feet. The gait itself was wrong. Humans traversing steep ice shift their center of gravity in predictable ways. This thing didn't. It moved like the slope was flat ground. Dr. James Hartley, who'd spent 15 years studying primate locomotion at Oxford, was more disturbed by what he called the kinetic economy. He estimated the figure was covering ground at roughly 3 times the pace of an experienced climber on the same terrain. More unsettling, Thermal analysis of the few frames where the figure was clearly defined suggested it wasn't wearing the bulky insulated clothing necessary for survival at that temperature. The shape was too streamlined, too form-fitting. Either it was adapted to withstand temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes, or the footage showed something else entirely. The third analyst refused to be identified even in private circulation of his findings. His report focused on one detail everyone else had noted but hesitated to emphasize. When the figure turned its head toward the camera, the movement was too smooth, too controlled, predator-like. He wrote that it reminded him of big cat behavior, the way a leopard will lock eyes with prey before deciding whether to attack or conserve energy. Intelligence assessment, he called it. The figure was gathering information. Then, there was the audio. The video's sound had been mostly ignored in initial viewings, written off as wind noise and the climber's labored breathing. But when a sound engineer in Berlin isolated and enhanced the audio frequencies, something else emerged. Starting at the 1 minute, 12-second mark beneath the wind and breathing, there are vocalizations. Deep, guttural sounds that pulse in irregular patterns. They're not constant. They come in bursts, 12 distinct vocalizations over a 90-second period. The recordings were sent to primatologists, wildlife audio specialists, and linguistic experts. None could categorize them. They weren't gorilla vocalizations, weren't any known great ape. The frequency range was lower than typical primate calls, resonant in a way that suggested a large chest cavity. But the patterning, several experts noted, had structure. Repetition with variation. What linguists call phonemic consistency. Not language necessarily, but not random animal sounds either. One researcher compared them to humpback whale songs. Complex, structured, possibly communicative. Another noted similarities to elephant infrasound, those low-frequency rumbles elephants used to communicate across miles. But this was neither. This was something unidentified, unclassified, and according to every expert who analyzed it, deeply unnerving. The expedition members themselves became the final piece of evidence. 5 climbers from Portugal and Spain. Experienced high-altitude mountaineers with multiple 8,000-meter peaks between them. After they descended from Dhaulagiri, after the footage made its quiet rounds through the climbing community, researchers tried to contact them. 2 refused to respond. One sent a single-line email. "Don't ask me about this." Another would only say that they'd abandoned their summit attempt immediately after the sighting and descended as fast as safely possible. The 5th member, Carlos Mendes, agreed to one phone interview. Way. The researcher who spoke with him said Carlos sounded hollowed out, his voice flat and effectless. He described the 3 days following the sighting. How none of them could sleep. How they'd hear sounds outside their tents at night. Movement on ice that shouldn't have had anything moving on it. How on the second night, something large had circled their camp, staying just beyond the range of their headlamps. They'd found tracks the next morning. Bipedal. Massive. Crossing areas of the glacier that their own route had carefully avoided because the ice was too unstable. The tracks showed no sign of crampon points, no evidence of technical equipment. Just deep impressions, each step perfectly placed on stable ice as if whatever made them could sense the internal structure of the glacier. Carlos said they packed up and descended that day, leaving thousands of dollars worth of fixed ropes and cached equipment. None of them have returned to the Himalayas. One sold all his climbing gear. Another, a professional guide who'd made his living leading expeditions, changed careers entirely. When asked directly what he thought they'd seen, Carlos was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "It knew we were there. It wanted us to see it. And I think it wanted us to leave." The 2014 footage might have remained an isolated incident, disturbing but singular, except for what emerged in 2016. A French expedition on Annapurna captured similar footage at 22,000 feet. Different mountain, different conditions, but the same impossible movement across vertical terrain. The same deliberate pause and turn toward the camera. The same unhurried departure. They also descended early. They also refused interviews. A year later, footage from Nanga Parbat. Then, in 2019, from Cho Oyu. Each video shows the same behavioral pattern. The figure appears at extreme altitude, above 20,000 feet where humans can barely function. It moves across impossible terrain. It becomes aware of the camera. Then comes the crucial detail. It positions itself to be clearly visible before departing. Enhancement analysis of the Annapurna footage revealed something that sent researchers back to re-examine the original Dhaulagiri video. In several frames, the figure appears to be facing the camera directly. Given the distance and atmospheric distortion, facial features are impossible to distinguish. But the posture, the stillness, suggests observation. Assessment.I. One analyst described it as the moment you realize you're not watching wildlife. You're being evaluated by something with intent. The pattern suggests territoriality. Warnings. We know you're here. We're letting you see us. This is our mountain. It's the behavior of an apex predator, confident enough not to hide, intelligent enough to communicate through demonstration rather than confrontation. The most recent footage, uploaded to a private mountaineering server 8 months ago, shows the clearest view yet. 23,000 feet on Makalu. The figure is closer this time, perhaps 200 yards from the camera. For nearly a full minute, it stands in clear view, completely motionless except for its head, which tracks the camera's movement as the climber pans. Then it raises one arm, holds it extended for 5 seconds and turns away. Was it a gesture? A warning? A wave? The climber who filmed it hasn't spoken publicly. But sources say he was found in his tent 3 hours later, unresponsive, staring at nothing. Severe psychological shock, the expedition doctor reported. He was helicoptered off the mountain the next day and spent 2 weeks in psychiatric care in Kathmandu. He's home now, somewhere in Austria, but he's never released the original footage. What circulates is a copy of a copy, degraded but still clear enough to see that deliberate, impossible gesture. 7 videos now. 7 different expeditions. Same mountains. Same behavior. And each time, the people who witness it come back changed. Broken in ways that have nothing to do with altitude sickness or physical exhaustion. They've seen something that shouldn't exist, behaving in ways that suggest not just existence but intelligence. Awareness. Purpose. The footage remains unverified by mainstream science, dismissed or ignored by institutions unwilling to engage with evidence that challenges comfortable certainties. But among climbers, among those who go to the highest, most remote places on Earth, the videos circulate with the weight of testimony. They watch them in private, share them carefully, and increasingly, they avoid certain routes, certain mountains, certain elevations where the sightings cluster. Because if the pattern holds, if the behavior is truly territorial warning, then something lives up there in the death zone where nothing should survive. Something that's decided to make itself known in the most controlled, deliberate way possible. Not hiding anymore. Watching. Waiting to see what we'll do with the knowledge that we're not alone up there, and that whatever shares those peaks with us is tired of being treated like myth. The snow fell softly on the morning of March 15, 2021, when Sherpa guide Pemba Tsering photographed a line of tracks ascending toward the Makarmo Ridge at 19,000 feet. The prints measured 14 inches in length, showing 5 distinct toes and a pronounced arch. What made them particularly compelling was not just their size or clarity, but their location. The temperature at that altitude had dropped to -30°F the previous night. The tracks appeared in snow that had fallen after midnight, meaning whatever created them had been walking through conditions that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Pemba sent the photographs to 3 separate wildlife biologists. All 3 confirmed that the tracks matched no known animal in the region. The stride length suggested a bipedal creature over 7 feet tall. The depth and spacing indicated significant weight distributed on 2 legs. And perhaps most unsettling, the trail simply appeared midway up an exposed slope, as if whatever made it had materialized from thin air, walked 200 yards, then vanished again at the edge of a cliff face that dropped 3,000 feet into the valley below. These tracks are not unusual. They are not rare. They continue to appear with troubling regularity in places where nothing should survive. In November 2019, a Japanese climbing expedition recorded video footage of a dark figure moving across the Lhotse face at 23,000 feet. The creature appeared to be walking upright without oxygen equipment, without protective gear, through winds exceeding 70 miles per hour. The expedition leader, a veteran of 12 Himalayan ascents, submitted the footage to video forensic experts in Tokyo and London. Both analyses concluded the same thing. The footage showed no evidence of digital manipulation. The figure cast shadows consistent with the lighting conditions, and its movement patterns did not match any known animal or any human climbing technique. The figure moved for approximately 4 minutes across terrain that would require ropes, ice axes, and extreme caution from experienced mountaineers. It moved with fluid confidence, never hesitating, never stopping to assess the route. Then it stepped behind a serac, a tower of glacial ice, and never emerged on the other side. The expedition members searched the area the following day. They found nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Except the video remains. Experts cannot debunk it. They can only confirm what it appears to show, and admit they cannot explain what they are seeing. The DNA evidence has become one of the most cited arguments against the Yeti's existence, and yet the story it tells is more complex than simple dismissal. When renowned geneticist Brian Sykes analyzed hair samples from the Himalayas in 2013, he found genetic matches to known animals, ancient polar bears, and modern species. Many celebrated this as definitive proof that the Yeti was nothing more than misidentification. But contamination is not fabrication. Finding bear DNA on a hair sample collected from a monastery where the specimen had been handled for decades, stored in uncontrolled conditions, and touched by countless pilgrims, proves only that the sample was contaminated. It does not prove the original source was fraudulent. Consider what the failed DNA results actually demonstrate. They prove that maintaining uncontaminated biological evidence in remote monasteries for centuries is impossible. They prove that modern collection methods in the field are often inadequate. They prove that we have not yet obtained a pristine, uncontaminated sample. What they do not prove is that the creature does not exist. Absence of evidence, particularly contaminated evidence, is not evidence of absence, and there remain specimens that defy complete identification. The Pangbosh hand, photographed extensively before its disappearance, showed skeletal structure that multiple primatologists found inconsistent with known apes. The scalps held in various monasteries, while likely created from known animals, are fashioned in ways that suggest they represent something the creators had witnessed. Why would isolated communities across hundreds of miles of mountain ranges independently create similar representations of an imaginary creature? The cultural consistency is perhaps the most overlooked evidence. The Sherpa people did not develop their beliefs about the Yeti through books or media. These are ancestral warnings passed through generations, embedded in their relationship with the mountains long before Western explorers arrived. The Lepcha people of Sikkim have their own independent traditions about the creature they call Lomung. The Tibetans speak of the Magoi. The Bhutanese know it as the Mickey. These cultures developed in relative isolation from one another, separated by some of the most impassable terrain on Earth, yet their descriptions align with remarkable consistency. A large bipedal creature, covered in reddish-brown or gray hair, standing between 7 and 9 feet tall, with a conical head, prominent brow ridge, and shoulders broader than any human. Descriptions separated by 3 centuries and thousands of miles match in their essential detail. This consistency across cultures and time cannot be easily dismissed as folklore or imagination. The Himalayas themselves provide the final, most compelling evidence: vast, unexplored emptiness. The mountain range stretches 1,500 miles, containing hundreds of peaks over 20,000 feet. The remote valleys of Bhutan, the northern reaches of Nepal, the restricted areas of Tibet, vast regions, have never been systematically explored by modern humans. Satellite imagery shows terrain, but cannot reveal what moves through the forests, what inhabits the caves, what traverses the glaciers at night. Consider the numbers. More than 10,000 people have summited Mount Everest, but Everest represents a single, well-traveled route through an enormous wilderness. Gangkhar Puensum, Bhutan's highest peak, at 24,800 feet, remains unclimbed. The Bhutanese government has prohibited mountaineering since 2003, meaning vast areas surrounding the mountain have seen virtually no human presence. These unexplored regions could conceal populations of unknown species indefinitely. The mountain gorilla was not scientifically documented until 1902. The Vu Quang ox, a large mammal, remained unknown to science until 1992. The assumption that we have cataloged all large animals on Earth is hubris, nothing more. Sherpa guides continue to report sightings with troubling regularity. These are not tourists seeking attention or amateur hikers prone to panic. These are professional mountaineers whose livelihoods depend on their credibility and judgment. In 2018, 3 Sherpa guides working on the Annapurna circuit reported watching a large bipedal figure observing their camp from a ridgeline at dawn. The creature stood motionless for several minutes, then turned and walked away, moving across steep terrain with ease. The guides did not publicize the sighting. They reported it to their community elders, maintaining the traditional protocols their ancestors established centuries ago. The warnings persist. Do not travel alone in certain valleys. Do not camp in specific locations. Avoid particular trails after dark. These are not quaint superstitions maintained for tourist appeal. These are practical warnings that Sherpa families teach their children, guidelines that have kept people safe for generations. The question is, safe from what? The most unsettling possibility is not that the Yeti is an undiscovered primate species, clumsy and primitive, blundering through the mountains while somehow evading detection. The most unsettling possibility is intelligence, deliberate avoidance. A species that understands what humans represent and has actively chosen to remain hidden. The tracks that appear and vanish suggest knowledge of terrain and weather patterns. The sightings that occur at dawn and dusk, in remote locations during storms, suggest strategic timing. The absence of bodies, of dens, of territorial markings that other large predators leave behind. This absence might not be coincidence, but design. What if we share this planet with an intelligence that has watched us for millennia, observed our expansion and our violence, and made the calculated decision to remain beyond our reach? What if the Yeti is not an evolutionary dead end hiding in the mountains, but a successful species that learned the most important survival skill: avoid humanity at all costs? The footprints continue to appear in fresh snow at altitudes where nothing should survive. The Sherpa guides continue to maintain their ancestral warnings, not for money, not for attention, but because something in those mountains commands respect and caution. The footage remains unexplained. The cultural consistency remains unaddressed. The vast unexplored wilderness remains indifferent to our certainty. Something leaves those tracks in the snow. Something watches from the peaks in the thin air where humans cannot long survive. And perhaps the truth that unsettles us most is not that we might share this world with an unknown creature, but that we might share it with an intelligence that has successfully kept its secrets, that has outmaneuvered our technology and our arrogance, and that may prefer the distance between us to remain exactly as it is. The Himalayas keep their mysteries. The question is whether we are humble enough to accept that some questions may remain unanswered, some territories unexplored, and some truths forever beyond our reach. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.